My mother canceled my 30th birthday party 3 days before the event. Not because of an illness or a genuine emergency, but because my younger sister had staged another crisis exactly when the attention was finally supposed to be on me. "We're canceling your birthday," Mom said the moment I answered. "Your sister needs us." Behind me, 40 engraved place cards sat beside unopened wine bottles on the kitchen counter. I had already paid the restaurant deposit, booked a photographer, and arranged transportation for relatives who had promised they would finally show up for me. When I asked what happened this time, she said it was just a fight with Jenna's boyfriend. She's devastated. Before I could respond, my father texted, "You're the strong one. You'll understand." That sentence had erased graduations, promotion, holidays, and every milestone I had earned. But this time I had expected the sabotage days earlier. Jenna had complained my party was excessive, then suddenly announced she was emotionally falling apart. I didn't cancel the restaurant. I transferred the reservation to a local charity, packed one suitcase, emptied the account my parents could access, and drove 4 hours toward the lake house my grandfather Frank had left behind. My family assumed I would calm down and return. They didn't know what I found among Frank's papers. They didn't know why my mother had spent years teaching me to accept second place. And when they followed Jenna again, they never returned to the life they had built. 10 years later, one final letter forced them to face what choosing her had truly caused. Before I tell you what was hidden in that letter and what happened after I disappeared, tell me what time is it where you are? And where are you watching from? I want to know how far this story travels. The lake house sat at the end of a private road my mother had always described as unsafe and impractical. Growing up, she discouraged me from visiting unless the entire family came, claiming Grandpa Frank was stubborn, secretive, and obsessed with old grudges. But Frank had been the only person who never called me strong when he really meant convenient. He died 8 months before my canceled birthday. And according to Mom, he left behind a deteriorating cabin, a few acres of useless land, and years of unpaid maintenance. She said the attorney was still resolving complications. I believed her because believing her was easier than admitting my own mother might be hiding something from me. By the time I reached the lake that night, the blacktop had narrowed to gravel, and the gravel eventually became packed dirt. The porch light was already on, cutting through the damp air. A man in a dark jacket stepped outside as I parked. For one irrational second, I imagined Grandpa waiting for me. Then the stranger introduced himself as Harold Green, Frank's estate attorney. "Your grandfather told me you might come here after your 30th birthday," he said. I almost laughed. He predicted my birthday would be canceled. He predicted your mother would create a reason you couldn't celebrate it. Harold unlocked the house and led me into Frank's study. The room smelled of old paper and cedar. His reading glasses still rested beside a half-finished crossword date-stamped the week he died. A framed photograph of me at 17 stood on the desk, sun-bleached from years in the same spot. I noticed there was no family portrait of my parents anywhere in the room. No picture of Jenna. Only me. Have you ever walked into a room and known, before anyone spoke a word, that the truth you'd been missing was already laid out on the desk? That's what I felt when Harold placed the folder down. Inside was Frank's will, signed 2 years earlier. He had left the lake property, 32 surrounding acres, and a controlling interest in a land development company to me. Not to Mom. Not to Jenna, to me. The assets were worth millions. A resort group had already offered to buy part of the shoreline. But Frank rejected the proposal because it would damage the lake. Instead, he wanted the property developed as an artist's retreat. Exactly what I had dreamed about during the summers I spent painting beside him. Harold explained there was one condition I received full control on my 30th birthday. Until then, my mother held temporary administrative authority. My stomach tightened. I had turned 32 weeks before, and she had said nothing about any of this. She had canceled my birthday instead. I looked at the framed photo of myself at 17, wearing a paint-smeared shirt, smiling at something Frank must have said. In that moment, I understood the canceled party wasn't just cruelty. It was a cover. My mother had needed me distracted, far from the lake. While she finished whatever she'd started with Frank's money, Harold pushed the folder closer. "There's more," he said. I turned the page and read the next line. The assets were not to be divided among the family. They were mine alone. The lake property, 32 surrounding acres, and a controlling interest in a land development company, all of it signed over to me. Not to Mom. Not to Jenna. The numbers were staggering. Million. Harold confirmed. A resort group had already offered to buy part of the shoreline. But Frank rejected the proposal because it would damage the lake. Instead, he wanted the property developed as an artist's retreat. Exactly what I had dreamed about during the summers I spent painting beside him. I remembered those afternoons. The way light caught the water. The smell of turpentine and pine. He had asked once what I would build if I could. A place where people come to make things. I said. He nodded and went back to his crossword. I hadn't thought about that conversation in years, but there was a condition. Harold's voice dropped. You received full control on your 30th birthday. Until then, your mother held temporary administrative authority. My stomach had already tightened. But now it dropped? My birthday had passed 2 weeks earlier and she had said nothing. She had canceled the party instead. I thought of the 40-place cards. The photographer. The relatives who never showed. They weren't accidents. They were cover. Have you ever uncovered a secret that made you question everything about the people you trusted most? I looked at Frank's handwriting on the folder's edge. He had known. He had predicted the cancellation. Predicted my mother would find a reason to keep me away. That was why he tied the transfer to my 30th birthday, so I would be old enough to fight back before she could take it all. The artist's retreat. The protected shoreline. The company. All of it had been waiting for me to turn 30. And she had spent those final weeks trying to rewrite the plan. She had canceled my birthday to buy herself time. The realization didn't feel like anger. It felt like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place. I turned to the next page. And the numbers made my hands go cold. I turned the page. The next folder was thinner but heavier. Harold didn't speak. He just watched as I opened it and saw the numbers nearly $400,000 missing from the estate's operating account. My mother had labeled the withdrawals as maintenance, legal fees, and emergency repairs. But the supporting documents told a different story. Line after line of payments for my sister's rent, credit card debts I never knew she had. Private retreats, she called, wellness intensives. 3 failed business projects that had no product and no customers. And a deposit on a luxury wedding venue reserved for a date when she wasn't even engaged. The boyfriend she'd been crying over had never proposed. The venue fee alone was $72,000. Non-refundable. My hands were cold. Frank knew. Harold said quietly. He discovered the theft 6 months before he died. He didn't confront your mother directly. Instead, he amended the trust so that full control transferred to you on your 30th birthday automatically, bypassing her authority entirely. He believed she would try to manipulate you into signing away your inheritance once you knew about it. I stared at the numbers, trying to remember every time Mom had called the lake house a money pit, trying to reconcile the woman who complained about leaky roofs with the woman who had charged a grand piano for Jenna's apartment under emergency structural repairs. The receipts were right there. A party of 2 at a $500 a plate restaurant labeled contractor consultation, a 100 sim. 000 payment to a life coach for Jenna that said legal fees. It was so brazen it almost worked because no one questioned Mom's judgment. No one except Frank. I looked at the bottom of the folder. There was a single sheet of paper, folded unevenly, in Frank's shaky handwriting. I recognized it from the letters he used to send me at summer camp. "Maddie," it began, "they taught you that strength means surrendering what is yours. It doesn't. Strength means protecting what matters. Even when the people demanding your sacrifice share your blood." My throat closed. He had known exactly what would happen. He had known she would cancel my birthday, that she would try to keep me away, that she would drain the estate while smiling at me over a 3-1 candle grocery store cake, and he had built a legal wall around what was mine. But I knew something he hadn't accounted for: my mother's desperation. She had already spent the money. She couldn't put it back. That meant she would try something worse. Have you ever had to choose between believing the people who raised you and believing a dead man's warning? I reread the note. Strength means protecting what matters. I folded it into my pocket. Then I asked Harold one more question. "Did Frank ever tell you he suspected my birthday would be canceled?" Harold hesitated, then opened his phone and showed me a calendar entry from 8 months earlier. A note Frank had typed: Maddie's 30th cut. Expect a crisis that weekend. If she calls, tell her to come straight here. I hadn't called. I had just shown up, but he had been ready for me anyway. That was the moment I stopped being a daughter who hoped her family would change and started becoming the person Frank had trusted to finish what he started. I sat in Frank's study with the note still warm in my pocket and asked Harold to pull everything he had on the timeline of my mother's withdrawals. Over the next 3 hours, Priya's spreadsheet grew into a map of manipulation. Every significant estate event a document requiring my signature. An investment maturing. An estate meeting scheduled lined up perfectly with a crisis from Jenna. I started connecting dots I had been too scared to look at for years. My college savings were drained when I was 12. Right after Jenna was expelled from private school, Mom paid the settlement to keep it quiet. I was told my advanced summer art program lost my application. The same month, an estate account recorded a large transfer labeled Educational Adjustment. When I was 16, Frank invested in a design portfolio I'd been selling online. Mom closed the account 7 days later, saying it violated tax rules. Jenna had just complained that my success made her feel inadequate. The estate records showed a matching withdrawal for family therapy expenses. At 22, a gallery invited me to join a group exhibition. Jenna ended an engagement the same week and threatened self-harm if the family attended my opening instead of staying with her. Mom pressured me to withdraw, promising another opportunity would come. It never did. The estate paid for Jenna's recovery retreat that month, $31,000. But the clearest proof came in an email recovered from Frank's old server. 3 days before my birthday, Jenna wrote to Mom, "Are you sure this will work? She already paid for everything." Mom replied, "She'll be angry. But she always comes back. Once she signs the revised authorization, we can reimburse the account later." Jenna asked, "And if she asks about Grandpa's company?" Mom answered, "She doesn't know she owns it." I read those words 6 times. My mother had planned my canceled birthday like a business transaction. Jenna's breakdown wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a timed distraction. While I was supposed to be comforting her, exhausted and guilty, my family would slide a document in front of me that transferred voting authority over Frank's company to Mom for 5 more years. I would have signed it. I always signed the things they put in front of me when I was tired. Have you ever read an email that made your entire childhood feel like it was written by someone else? The development consortium that had increased its shoreline offer was waiting. If Mom gained control, she could sell the land, replace the money she stole, give Jenna a fortune, and still appear successful. Frank's protected lake would become luxury condominiums. The artist's retreat would vanish, and I would be back in the city, apologizing for being difficult. I closed the laptop and looked at Harold. She didn't just steal money. She stole every chance I had to grow up believing I mattered. He nodded slowly. That's why Frank amended the trust. He knew she would never stop My first instinct was to call them right then and expose everything. I wanted to hear my mother explain the email. I wanted to listen to Jenna stammer through a lie she couldn't finish. But Harold stopped me before I reached for the phone. Revenge delivered too early becomes a warning, he said. Right now they think you're just angry about a birthday. Let them keep believing that. I understood. If they knew I had the documents, my mother would start hiding evidence faster than I could collect it. Jenna would delete her messages. Dad would freeze, unsure which side to choose. So when my phone buzzed the next morning and Mom's name appeared, I took a breath and answered with a voice that sounded tired instead of furious. Maddie. Thank God. We've been terrified. I closed my eyes and pictured the email. I just needed time. I said, I'm still processing. You scared your sister? She thinks you hate her. I don't hate her. Mom exhaled. And I could hear the relief she was manufacturing. Come home this weekend. We'll have dinner. Your father wants to discuss paperwork related to Grandpa's property, nothing complicated. Just a few signatures. There it was. Not an apology. Not a question about where I was sleeping or whether I had eaten. The paperwork, I'll think about it. I said, Maddie? We're your family. For 30 years. Those words had been a lock. This time they sounded like a confession. I ended the call without accusing. Without raising my voice. Without giving her any reason to suspect I knew anything beyond hurt feelings. Then I let the silence stretch while I mapped out my next moves. Have you ever had to pretend you were still blind while you were already holding the map? I spent the following week buying time while Harold froze every trust account. He notified the banks that my mother's administrative authority had ended effective immediately. He preserved every message my family sent me, tagging timestamps and metadata for the investigator Priya had recommended. Meanwhile, Priya herself reconstructed the full withdrawal history, every single transfer, every forged signature, every account that had been drained. She traced the $400,000 outflow to 6 different shell accounts and 2 real estate payments that never closed. I documented the lake house damage myself. I walked through every room with a notebook and a camera, cataloging unpaid invoices from contractors Mom had hired and never paid, rooms that had been emptied of furniture. She later claimed she sold boxes Frank had organized by year that were now scattered and broken. I met with contractors who had worked on Frank's properties, reviewed company records with Harold's paralegal Beck, and contacted Frank's former business partners to learn the full extent of what I now controlled. By the end of the second week, I had replaced the compromised financial manager, rejected a new proposal from the developer, and begun formal negotiations with an environmental foundation that wanted to protect the shoreline permanently. Every time my phone rang with Jenna's number, I let it go to voicemail. Every time Mom left a message asking if I had decided about dinner, I listened and said nothing. They were still certain I would come back. They didn't realize I had already stopped needing their permission to build a life that didn't include them. One afternoon, while I was still cataloging the damage, I found a box shoved behind Frank's old filing cabinet. The label on the side was written in his shaky hand, Madison, after she learns the truth. I pulled it into the light and lifted the lid. Inside were my childhood drawings, things I had long assumed were thrown away. Charcoal portraits I'd done of Frank sitting by the lake. Watercolor houses with crooked windows. Sketches of imagined gardens with flowers that didn't exist. And a childish blueprint I'd drawn when I was 11, an art center with a big deck overlooking the water. He'd saved everything, even the ones I'd crumpled and thrown in the trash. Underneath the artwork was a thick envelope. I opened it and found a letter, typed and dated 2 years before Frank died. He described 3 incidents I barely remembered, each one carefully documented with supporting evidence. When I was 12, he had created education accounts for Jenna and me. Mine was larger because I was older and had been accepted into an advanced summer art program. 2 years later, Jenna was expelled from private school for stealing an exam and blaming another student. My mother paid the school to keep it quiet. The money came from my account. I had been told the summer program lost my application. Frank included the bank statement showing the transfer when I was 16. I built a design portfolio and started selling prints online. Frank invested a small amount to help me grow it. Mom closed the account after Jenna complained that my success made her feel inadequate. I was told the website violated tax rules. Frank had a copy of the closure notice and a message from Mom to him. Madison is resilient. Jenna is fragile. We have to protect the one who needs it. When I was 22, a gallery invited me to join a group exhibition. Jenna had just ended an engagement and threatened to hurt herself if the family attended my opening instead of staying with her. Mom pressured me to withdraw. Frank included a letter Mom wrote him that week. Madison can recover from disappointment. Jenna cannot. We have to invest our resources where they are most needed. Resources. Not affection. Not fairness. Resources. I read that sentence 3 times. My mother had turned favoritism into a financial policy. Because I functioned without collapsing, my stability was treated as permission to take more. Every time I survived, she interpreted it as proof that I could survive again. And every time Jenna broke down, she received the money, the attention, the protection that had been taken from me. Frank had attached dates, bank statements, and copies of Mom's handwritten notes. He had built a dossier of theft disguised as love. He wanted me to see it all, not to make me bitter, but to make me free. I sat on the floor of his study with the papers spread around me. And for the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt clean. The truth was finally mine. I didn't have to wonder anymore. I didn't have to doubt my memory or question whether I was being dramatic. My mother had been running a system, and Frank had left me the evidence to dismantle it. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect? That afternoon in Frank's study, I made my choice. I wasn't going to keep the peace anymore. 6 weeks after my canceled birthday, I returned to my parents' house wearing a plain navy suit and carrying a leather folder. Harold waited in a car down the street. Engine running. Phone charged. I had told him I needed one final answer before deciding how far to go. Did my father know? He opened the front door before I knocked, wrapped his arms around me, and said, "There's my strong girl." The phrase nearly made me turn around and walk back to the car. Instead, I stepped inside and smelled something sweet, vanilla frosting. Mom had set up a grocery store birthday cake in the center of the dining table. 31 candles stuck out of the white icing, unevenly spaced, like she had pressed them in while distracted. "We can celebrate next year early," she said, smiling. No sense letting a milestone pass without cake. Jenna was already seated, wearing an oversized gray sweater that swallowed her frame. No makeup. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail that made her look fragile, like she hadn't slept in days. She offered a small wave. I didn't return it. Dad poured wine. Mom touched my shoulder. Jenna apologized for needing support at the wrong time, her voice soft and rehearsed. Then Mom placed a document beside my plate before the first bite of cake could be served. "We should handle this before dessert," she said, sliding the paper closer to me. "It simply allows me to manage Grandpa's property until the estate is settled. Nothing complicated." I opened it and pretended to read. The same language I had seen in Harold's files: transfer of administrative authority for 5 more years. I looked up at my father. "Did you read this?" He didn't meet my eyes. "Your mother understands financial matters better than I do." That wasn't my question. Jenna shifted in her chair. "Why are you making this hostile? It's just paperwork." I turned to her. "When did you learn Grandpa left the company to me?" Her expression flickered just a fraction of a second before she looked down at her plate. "I don't know what you're talking about." Mom answered for her. No one knows exactly what your grandfather intended. He was confused toward the end. I kept my voice even. He passed 3 cognitive evaluations during the year he amended the trust. The room went still. The only sound was the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. I left the document sitting beside my plate and waited. I reached into my leather folder and pulled out the copies. The will, the trust amendment, and the withdrawal records. The pages were crisp, each one flagged with a sticky note where Harold had marked the critical numbers. I placed them on the table one by one, spreading them in a fan across the white linen cloth. Mom's color drained first, a slow fade that started at her hairline and crept down to her jaw. Dad picked up the top page, the withdrawal summary, and his hands began to tremble as he read the total $416,000 transferred to accounts connected to Jenna. Some of those transfers had passed through the joint account he shared with Mom. He looked up at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Susan." Mom's shock hardened into anger in less than a second. She straightened her shoulders and spoke as if she were correcting an employee. "That money belongs to this family. I was protecting everyone." She said it with such conviction that for a moment I almost believed her. But I had seen the emails. I had read the line about me not knowing I owned the company. Jenna slammed her palm against the table, rattling the silverware. "Grandpa gave you everything because you manipulated him by visiting him. You made him feel sorry for you." Her voice cracked at the end, the accusation carrying more jealousy than righteousness. I didn't respond. Instead, I reached into the folder again and placed the printed emails on top of the financial records. 2 pages, side by side. Jenna saw the first one, her own question to Mom, and stopped talking. Her mouth hung open. Dad picked up the email and read Mom's reply aloud, his voice flat, like he was reading a stranger's words. "She doesn't know she owns it." He lowered the page and stared at my mother as if he were seeing her for the first time. "You planned the call?" he said. "Not a question. A fact." Mom's anger flickered, but she held her ground. I was preventing Madison from making an impulsive decision. Dad shook his head slowly. "You canceled her birthday to get her signature. No one answered." I watched Jenna's face as she finally understood that the scripts she had rehearsed were useless. The silence stretched long enough that I could hear my own heartbeat. The silence after that question was heavier than any sound I had ever heard. Dad's hand was still holding the email, his knuckles white against the paper. He looked at my mother, and something in his face changed. Not anger, but the slow collapse of a man realizing he had been a prop in a play he never auditioned for. "You told me she was upset about the birthday," he said. "You said she needed space." Mom's composure cracked at the edges. "I was protecting us. You have no idea what it's like to manage a family while everyone expects you to be the fixer." I stepped forward before she could build another story. "While you're fixing, let me tell you what else I found." I reached into my folder and pulled out a separate sheet, the timeline I had reconstructed with Priya. "My college savings. The year I turned 12, you drained my education account to pay the settlement after Jenna was expelled." Mom's mouth opened, but I kept going. "My co-signed apartment. You pressured me to sign, then let her abandon it. The landlord came after my credit for 2 years. And the savings account I had for my first car, you transferred it to cover her emergency while I was at summer camp." I listed each one, my voice steady. "Every milestone I earned, you stole and gave to her." Dad turned to Mom. "Is that true?" She didn't answer. He looked at me, his eyes wet. I didn't know about the trust, but I never checked if she replaced the money. I held his gaze. "No, you didn't." Mom started gathering the papers off the table, stacking them like she could erase the evidence. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You're emotional. Madison, you're letting anger cloud your judgment. We'll talk about this when you've calmed down." She reached for the will. but I put my hand flat on top of the stack. She froze. "No," I said. "Tonight you listen." I looked at both of them. "I'm offering 2 paths." I spoke slowly, making sure every word landed. "First path, you return every recoverable dollar. Surrender all claims against Grandpa's estate. Provide complete financial records. And sign a written admission. Then we handle this privately." Jenna's chair scraped the floor as she stood. "And the second?" she asked, her voice thin. "I file a formal fraud complaint. The evidence goes to the authorities. The family home. Your reputation. Everything you built on that money, it all goes through investigation." Mom's face went pale again, but she didn't scream. She just stared at the documents under my hand. "You would send your own mother to prison, no?" I said. "Your decisions might. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect? Because in that moment, I realized peace had never been real. It had just been me staying quiet so everyone else could pretend." Mom's hand hovered over the papers, trembling. She didn't take the folder. She didn't answer. She just turned and walked out of the dining room, her heels clicking against the hardwood like a countdown. Jenna stood so quickly, her chair tipped backward and hit the floor with a crack that echoed through the silent room. "You're destroying us over money you don't even need." Her voice was high and shaking. The kind of pitch she used when she wanted everyone to believe she was the victim. She gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white. "This isn't about justice. This is about revenge because we didn't throw you a stupid birthday party." Dad set down the email he'd been holding and looked at her. Really looked. For the first time that night. "What did you spend it on?" "Jenna." His question came out flat. Not angry. Just exhausted. $416,000. That's not pocket change. "Where did it go?" Jenna's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. Then, pieces started falling. Each one landing like a stone. The luxury apartment she'd been living in for the past year, the one she said a friend leased cheap. The leased vehicle she drove. A sedan I knew she couldn't afford on her own salary. Debts she'd racked up across credit cards. Store accounts. Even a personal loan from a shady online lender. The wellness company she'd launched 6 months earlier. The one with the glossy website and no actual sales, a fake business built on borrowed money and vapor, and the destination wedding venue she'd reserved. $50,000, non-refundable. For a ceremony she planned even though her boyfriend had never proposed. That boyfriend, she finally admitted, had ended the relationship 3 days before my birthday. He'd found out she lied about owning Frank's company. She'd bragged about controlling the land development firm, about millions in assets coming her way. When he discovered the truth that she had nothing, that she'd been stealing to pretend he walked out, her crisis wasn't real until the future she stole started crumbling. I watched her face as she spoke. Watched the cracks spread across the mask she'd worn my whole life. Every breakdown she'd ever staged had been a performance designed to pull attention back to her. But this time the stage was on fire. And there was no curtain to drop. Dad stood up slowly, pushed his chair in, and walked out of the dining room without another word. Mom followed a moment later. Still silent. Jenna stood alone beside the overturned chair. Her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold. I picked up the unsigned transfer document from the table and set it next to her plate. Exactly where she'd expected me to sign. "That's yours now," I said. "Figure out what you want to do with it." Then I walked out the front door, across the porch, and into the night. Behind me, I heard her say my name once. Then nothing. That night, Dad called Harold from the apartment he'd moved into 3 hours after leaving the dinner table. I got the update from Harold the next morning. Dad had given him full access to every joint account. Signed waivers. Handed over passwords. No conditions. No delays. He's cooperating completely, Harold said. But your mother refused to provide anything. She told my assistant the accounts are her business, and I have no authority to demand records. I wasn't surprised. Mom had spent 30 years controlling every financial thread in our family. She wasn't going to hand over the scissors just because the fabric was unraveling. 3 days later, I found out just how far she would go to keep that control. Harold called me at 7 in the morning. His voice tighter than I'd ever heard it. Your mother just attempted to transfer the family home into Jenna's name. She went to the county clerk's office and filed a quitclaim deed. The bank flagged it because the property is listed as collateral on multiple loans connected to Jenna's fake company. I set down my coffee and stared at the lake through the kitchen window. The water was still, the surface reflecting the early light. Everything around me felt calm. But inside I was cold and calculating. What happens now? The bank has frozen all accounts tied to that collateral, including several your mother was using for her charity donations. The creditors who lent money against those assets are starting to ask questions. They're pulling loan histories, requesting documentation. Your mother's reputation isn't going to survive this. I thought about the world she had built: the committee lunches, the fundraising galas, the friends who called her generous. None of them knew where the money came from. Now they would. Over the next week, the cracks spread fast. A creditor sent a letter demanding an explanation for the missing collateral documentation. The bank notified her that her personal accounts would be restricted until the ownership dispute was resolved. 2 board members from her favorite charity resigned, citing irregularities in donor records. Mom started calling me, leaving voicemails that swung between rage and pleading. You're destroying your own family. Madison, do you understand what you've done? I understood exactly what I had done. I had stopped covering for her. The difference was that she saw exposure as destruction, while I saw it as truth. Walking through the lake house that evening, I opened Frank's old map of the property and traced the shoreline with my finger. The land was safe. The retreat would be built, but the attempted house transfer had changed something fundamental. It had turned a private family betrayal into a matter for lawyers, investigators, and courts. There was no going back to quiet negotiations over birthday cake. My mother had drawn a line, and she had crossed it herself. I closed the map and called Harold. File the civil action. I'm done waiting. Those voicemails kept coming. But I stopped listening after the third one. Mom had moved from accusation to denial to a strange, brittle calm that suggested she was already planning her next move. I didn't have time to track her moods. Harold called 2 days later with something I hadn't expected. Your mother chaired 3 charity committees over the past 5 years, he said, his voice flat in the way it always got when he was holding back anger. I found estate payments to all 3 organizations. The amounts total $165. Ling ling ling. And she claimed the donations as her own on every tax return and press release. I pulled up the list he sent. Lakeside Children's Fund, Bright Futures Initiative, Heritage Arts Council, all legitimate nonprofits, all with Mom's name on their donor walls, her picture in their annual reports, her signature on fundraising letters that thanked generous friends while the money had actually come from Frank's estate. She was using stolen funds to buy public credit. I said, worse. Harold replied. She had the charities cut her checks for administrative services fees she claimed for organizing galas and silent auctions. The money went into her personal account. Then she wrote smaller checks back to the charities so she could deduct them on her taxes. It's a loop. She was laundering her own theft through nonprofit accounts. I closed my eyes. The woman who had taught me to share, to be grateful, to never embarrass the family. She had been running a shell game with my grandfather's inheritance. The first charity called her a week later. According to a friend of mine who still spoke to Mom, the Lakeside Children's Fund had discovered a discrepancy in the donor records. Mom told them it was an accounting error and promised to send a corrected statement. She didn't. The second charity, Bright Futures, asked her to resign from their board temporarily while they reviewed the donations. Mom called me that evening, her voice shaking with fury. "You're behind this, aren't you? You're running a smear campaign to destroy my reputation." I didn't answer. I hadn't contacted a single organization. The records spoke for themselves, and I didn't need to lift a finger. "Mom, I'm not doing anything. The evidence is what it is. You are destroying me. You are tearing apart this family over money that was never yours to begin with." I hung up. There was nothing left to say. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect? I had spent 30 years choosing the peace. This time I chose myself. The third charity, Heritage Arts Council, didn't call her at all. They called my father, asking for a meeting. Dad had no answers. He was already packing his things from the family home, moving into a 1-bedroom apartment with a pull-out couch and a kitchen, so small he had to turn sideways to open the refrigerator. He handed over every password, every tax return from the past decade, every piece of correspondence he could find. He didn't defend her, didn't explain. He just surrendered. I should have stopped it, he said when he dropped off the envelope at the lake house. I took it without inviting him inside. "Yes," I said. "You should have." He nodded and walked back to his car. I watched him drive away and realized I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, no relief. Just the quiet certainty that this was what happened when you let someone else's lies define the truth for too long. The charities all eventually received their full amounts from the estate recovery. But Mom's name was removed from the donor walls, her photo taken down from the annual reports. She had built her reputation on money she'd taken from a man she'd dismissed as stubborn and secretive. Frank had known exactly what he was doing when he left everything to me. He had trusted me to see the truth long after he was gone. 2 weeks after the charity records surfaced, my father showed up at the lake house without calling first. I was standing on the porch, coffee in hand, watching a pair of loons glide across the water. When his sedan pulled up the gravel drive, he stepped out slowly, like a man carrying something heavier than his own body. "I should have stopped it," he said before. I could ask why he was here. I didn't invite him inside. I just stood there and let the word hang. "Yes, you should have." He looked at the ground, then back at me. I kept telling myself Jenna needed more help. She was fragile. She couldn't handle disappointment. She'd fall apart if anyone held her accountable. I thought if I gave in enough times, she'd eventually stabilize. You knew helping her always meant taking from me. He flinched, but he didn't deny it. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small phone, one of those old flip models that barely hold a charge. "I found this in a locked drawer in your mother's desk. She must have forgotten it when she moved out. There are years of messages on here between her and Jenna." I took the phone. The screen was cracked, but it powered on. The messages were all there, saved like a chronicle of every scheme I had been too blind to see. The birthday plan was only the beginning. They had discussed pretending Dad was ill to make me feel guilty enough to move home, then appointing Mom as my financial representative temporarily. Jenna even suggested introducing me to a business partner of her ex-boyfriend, hoping a relationship would make me invest estate money in their projects. I scrolled deeper, and my breath caught. Mom had written about me in a message to Jenna. "She's emotionally predictable. She'll resist, then feel guilty. Give her time." I looked up at my father. His face was gray. "Did you know they were planning to fake your illness?" "No," he whispered. "I didn't know anything. I chose not to know." Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and keeping your self-respect? I had made that choice 100 times. And every time I chose peace, I lost a piece of myself, standing there with that phone in my hand. I realized the peace had never been real. It was just the absence of conflict. I was too exhausted to fight. I closed the flip phone and slipped it into my pocket. Thank you for bringing this. He waited, hoping for something more. Is there anything else? Not tonight. He nodded and walked back to his car. Smaller than I remembered. I didn't watch him drive away this time. I went inside, sat down at Frank's desk, and began reading the messages from the beginning. Each one was a thread in a web I had been caught in for 30 years. But now I had the map, and this time, I wasn't the fly. The next day, I called Harold and gave him the green light. File the civil action. I said, restitution. Removal of my mother from every estate roll. And damages for the attempted land transfer, including the legal fees, the lost opportunity with the Environmental Foundation, and the emotional distress this whole scheme cost me. I also want you to refer the evidence to the authorities for criminal investigation, every email, every withdrawal, every forged signature. Harold didn't hesitate. I'll have the papers drawn up by noon. The serving will happen within 48 hours. 2 days later, I got the update while standing in the restored kitchen of the lake house, watching contractors install new windows over the spot where the pane had been shattered by a falling branch. Harold's voice was calm but crisp. Your mother was served at the annual charity luncheon for the Lakeside Children's Fund. She was sitting at the head table, about to give a speech on community responsibility. The process server walked up in a suit, handed her the envelope, and said, "You've been served loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear?" She excused herself to the restroom and didn't return. I felt a cold satisfaction. Not because she was embarrassed in public, but because the truth had finally arrived in a form she couldn't talk her way out of. Jenna's service came the same afternoon. Harold's assistant drove to the address listed for her wellness brand office, a rented space in a strip mall between a discount mattress store and a tanning salon. The receptionist, a college kid Jenna had hired 2 months earlier, told the assistant that Miss Carter was in the back room filming a video about manifesting abundance. The assistant knocked, handed over the papers, and said, "This is a legal notice. Please read it carefully." Jenna's face went white behind the ring light. She shut the door without a word. Within a week, the dominoes started falling exactly as Harold had predicted. Jenna's landlord called her on a Thursday morning, informing her that the lease for both the office and her apartment were terminated for non-payment. The accounts had been frozen after the civil filing triggered a freeze on all assets connected to the stolen funds. By Friday, the repo company came for the leased BMW she'd been driving, towing it from the parking lot of the strip mall while she watched from the front window, and the wedding venue, the one she'd reserved with a $72,000 deposit, the one she'd been planning for a wedding to a man who didn't exist, sent a certified letter keeping most of the deposit, citing her false financial declarations on the reservation form. She lost everything that wasn't already spent. That evening, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me pick up. Jenna's voice came through, thin and cracked. "I have nowhere to go." She paused. "Mom won't answer my calls. Dad told me to figure it out myself. I'm sitting in a coffee shop with 2 suitcases." I leaned against the kitchen counter, looking out at the lake. "You can try Mom's place, though she might lose the house soon, since she attempted to give it to you to hide the assets." "You're enjoying this," Jenna whispered. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "No, I'm just not responsible for rescuing you anymore. Your decisions finally belong to you. Figure out what to do with them." The line went silent for 5 seconds, and then I heard a sob cut off by a sharp breath. "What am I supposed to say?" she asked. "The truth," I said. "To the investigators, to your creditors, to yourself. Then start over." I hung up before she could ask for money. That night, I blocked the unfamiliar number and went back to reviewing construction plans for the artist retreat. The next milestone was mine, The unfamiliar number flashed on my screen that evening. I almost ignored it. But something made me pick up. Jenna's voice came through. Thin and cracked. I have nowhere to go. Can I stay with you? I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching the last light fade over the lake. You can stay with Mom. She might lose the house because she attempted to give it to you to hide the assets. You're enjoying this, she whispered. Your decisions finally belong to you. I'm not rescuing you. A sharp breath? I didn't know it was stealing. Mom said the money would be mine eventually. She said Grandpa didn't understand the family's needs. I set down my coffee. Get a job. Sell what you own. Speak honestly with the investigators. And stop turning every consequence into someone else's emergency. You sound heartless. No. I sound unavailable. I ended the call and blocked the number before she could respond. Months passed. The civil case dragged through depositions and document reviews, each hearing exposing another layer of unauthorized borrowing and falsified expense reports. Mom eventually agreed to surrender the family home, liquidate investments, and return assets purchased with estate funds, but the recovered amount didn't cover everything. The criminal inquiry continued separately, with prosecutors building a file that would take another year to resolve. Dad filed for divorce without a single public statement. Jenna rented a single room in a shared house and took an administrative job at a dental office. She told relatives I had destroyed the family because Grandpa loved me more. Some believed her, others quietly distanced themselves. At the lake, construction began on Frank's artist retreat. We restored the original house, converted the old workshop into 2 light-filled studios, and created a scholarship for adults who had abandoned creative work because their families called it impractical. Every nail felt like a correction to the years I'd spent surrendering my own plans. 10 years passed. I didn't count them like calendar pages, I measured them in the growth of the place Frank had imagined. The original house stood at the center, restored and warm, with a wraparound porch where artists sat sketching at dawn. Surrounding it, 6 cabins curved along the shoreline, each one named after a paint color Frank had loved: ultramarine, ochre, viridian, sienna, cerulean, burnt umber. 2 shared studios opened their walls to natural light, and a community kitchen hummed with the smell of coffee and conversation from breakfast until late evening. The exhibition hall rose on the highest point of the property, its glass facade reflecting the protected shoreline that my mother had almost sold. Artists came from across the country, some young, some in their 60s, all carrying stories of work they'd been told was a distraction. Local students attended free workshops every Saturday, their drawings taped to every available surface. Environmental groups used the land for research, monitoring water quality and bird migration, data that helped preserve the lake for another generation. The land development company Frank had left me now funded all of it without touching the shoreline. I became the director. But I also went back to painting. For years I hadn't touched a brush, every time I tried. I heard my mother's voice asking when I would do something practical. Now I painted family photographs altered by memory-missing figures where my father should have stood, hidden faces where Jenna had been cropped out, empty chairs at tables that were supposed to hold celebrations. I worked from the images I had kept and the ones I had imagined. It was the only way I knew to make visible what had been erased. My first major exhibition was titled "The Strong One is Not Invisible." It opened at a gallery in the city, but I brought the show home to the lake house after the first week. On opening night at the retreat's exhibition hall, hundreds of people filled the room. Artists I had hosted, students I had taught, strangers who had read about the property in a magazine, all of them standing beneath the same roof my mother had planned to demolish. They looked at paintings of my grandfather's reading glasses, my childhood drawings, the place card from my canceled birthday that my father had kept. No one in my immediate bloodline attended. But I didn't look for them. CTA Have you ever had to build something beautiful just to prove that what they tried to destroy was never really yours? Mom avoided prison through a plea agreement. She paid restitution, accepted probation, submitted to financial monitoring, and completed community service at a food bank. She moved to a modest apartment in a suburb she had always described as beneath her, worked part-time at an insurance office, and wrote long ones, page after page blaming Frank, blaming Dad, blaming the legal system, blaming me for exaggerating ordinary family tensions. She never mentioned the $400,000 or the email about the birthday scheme. I read the first 2 letters, then stopped. She didn't want forgiveness. She wanted me to admit that I had been the one who broke everything. I never responded. Some silences are not absences. They are the truest answer you can give. Jenna took a different road slower, lonely, and far more painful than the one she had expected. For years after the lawsuit, she told anyone who would listen that I had stolen her inheritance. She repeated it at jobs she couldn't keep, in relationships that fell apart after a few months, to neighbors who eventually stopped answering their doors. Mom, confined to her insurance office and probation meetings, could no longer fund her life or fabricate emergencies on her behalf. Without that support, Jenna's world shrank. She moved through 7 jobs in 3 years: retail clerk, receptionist, telemarketer, dog walker, temps assistant, dishwasher, and finally a data entry position she managed to hold for 11 months. Each time she was fired or quit, she blamed me. Each time. The story grew thinner. Then an investigator working on the remaining criminal inquiry showed her Frank's original records, not the summaries Mom had given her, the actual documents. The education accounts Mom had redirected when Jenna was 14. The letters from Frank explaining that both accounts were meant to be equal, but that the older sisters had been drained to cover a settlement her parents never should have paid. Jenna sat in a conference room and read that her own tuition, her own lifestyle, her own failed business projects had been financed by money that was supposed to be mine. She learned, for the first time, that she had not been denied an inheritance. She had consumed mine. Bitte be bitte. While believing she was the victim, she didn't call me afterward. Instead, she entered therapy, something she had mocked for years, and quietly left social media. Over the next 2 years, she repaid a small portion of what was gone, $12,000, in checks that arrived every few months, each one accompanied by a short note with no accusations. "I'm working on it," one said. "I know it's not enough." She also stopped contacting me through alternate numbers, the burner phones and friends lines she had used to bypass my blocks. The silence was unfamiliar, but it was honest. 5 years after the lawsuit, a letter arrived at the lake house. Plain envelope. No return address. Postmarked from a city I didn't recognize. I opened it standing in the kitchen, and found Jenna's handwriting neater than I remembered. Less looped. As if she had practiced control. There was no accusation. No justification. No mention of the birthday or the money or the years of lies. Just 2 paragraphs. Maybe I didn't understand every legal detail, but I knew she was taking something meant for you. I let myself believe you could survive it because that made accepting what I received easier. I was jealous and I used being fragile as power. "I'm sorry." I read it 3 times, then placed it in the desk drawer beside Frank's note. I did not answer. An apology can be sincere without creating an obligation to reunite. Forgiveness does not require me to rebuild a bridge that was burned by someone else. Nor does it erase the years I spent invisible. I kept the letter because it mattered that she had written it, but I kept it closed. 2, because healing is not the same as opening the door again. On the 10th anniversary of my canceled birthday, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. Harold's name lit up the screen. He hadn't called me directly in years. Not since the final court date. I answered with my coffee cup still warm in my hand. "Madison," he said. And I heard something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not urgency. Not grief. A kind of quiet gravity. Like a door opening onto a room that had been waiting. "Your grandfather left a sealed instruction. The release date is today. There's a letter addressed to all four of you, your mother, your father, your sister. He required that the meeting take place at the lake, and that a video recording be played. Participation is voluntary, but he asked me to tell you that if anyone chooses not to come, the letter will be read anyway, and the recording viewed without them. Do you want to be there?" I thought of Frank's note about strength. I thought of the lake. Too still and cold under the Halloween sky. I said yes before I finished thinking. The meeting was set for noon. I spent the morning walking the exhibition hall, straightening frames I'd already straightened, watching the light shift across the restored shoreline. By 11:30, Harold arrived with a laptop case and a sealed manila envelope. He placed them on Frank's study desk without a word. Dad came first. He parked at the far end of the gravel drive and walked slowly, shoulders curved, head down. His hair had gone completely gray. He looked smaller than I remembered, not just older, but somehow compressed, as if the years had pressed him thinner. He nodded at me but didn't speak. He stood by the window, hands in his pockets, staring at the water. Jenna arrived next. Alone. She wore simple jeans and a dark sweater, no makeup, no oversized costume of fragility. Her face was softer than it had been at the exhibition, less guarded. She looked at me, then at Dad, then at the empty driveway. Neither of us spoke. She sat on the porch step and waited. Mom came last, pulling up in a compact sedan that still had dealer plates. She stepped out slowly, her hair silver and flat against her head. She had aged more than the others' lines around her mouth, a hesitation in her walk that wasn't there 10 years ago. She wore a plain coat, buttoned unevenly. No one hugged her. Harold opened the door and gestured us inside. We gathered around Frank's desk, standing awkwardly, like strangers at a funeral of someone none of us had really known. Harold placed the laptop in the center, pressed play, and stepped back. Frank's face filled the screen, the same faded plaid shirt he'd worn every summer, the same quiet eyes. He looked at the camera for a long moment, then spoke. Madison has reached 40. Enough time has passed for consequences to reveal character. Frank paused on the screen, his eyes holding the camera with the same steady patience he'd used when teaching me to mix oil paints. I met with Harold 2 months before I died. He continued, his voice gravelly but clear. We established a separate trust fund in the amount of $1 million. It was intended for your mother, father, and sister divided equally if they respected the property transfer and allowed Madison to control the company without interference. No manipulation, no hidden debts, no manufactured crises, just honesty. I let that sink in. And in the room, I heard Mom's breath catch. Jenna looked down at her hands. Dad didn't move. I didn't believe they could do it. Frank said, but I wanted to give them a chance to prove me wrong. The fund was conditional. If anyone concealed the inheritance, misused estate funds, or pressured my granddaughter to surrender her authority, the entire amount would be revoked and donated to the artist's retreat. I asked Madison to build. Mom's face went gray. She had just spent 10 years assuming she had stolen $400,000. Now she was learning that her actions had cost all three of them nearly $1 million more. Frank continued, his voice dropping lower. Susan, you may believe you protected your younger daughter. You did not. You taught her that love removes consequences, then called Madison cruel when she refused to keep paying them. He turned his gaze slightly, as if addressing Dad through the lens. To my son-in-law, silence is still a decision. You cannot surrender authority and later claim innocence because someone else used it badly. He paused, and I saw his jaw tighten. Tu Jenna. Pain deserves compassion. But pain is not ownership. Your sister's joy was never evidence of your neglect. Then his eyes fixed forward, and I knew he was speaking directly to me, even from beyond. And to Madison, their regret does not purchase your return. You owe them honesty, not access. Build the place we imagined. Celebrate every birthday they taught you to surrender. The screen went dark. The laptop hummed. No one spoke. Mom's whisper broke the silence. He set me up. Jenna answered before anyone else could. No. He gave us a choice. You just chose wrong. Every time, Mom turned on her. But Jenna didn't flinch. Everything I did was for you, Mom said, her voice cracking. You did it because you needed me dependent on you. Jenna replied flatly. That was the problem. Dad walked out of the room without a word. Mom looked at me with wet eyes. I lost everything, she said. I looked at her, the silver hair, the worn coat, the hollow face that had once commanded rooms and charity boards. No, I said. You lost what you believed you could take without consequences. She had no answer. I turned away and left the study, walking toward the exhibition hall where my real family was waiting. I walked alone to the edge of the lake. The retreat lights stretched across the water toward the shoreline. My mother almost sold 10 years earlier. I had arrived with one suitcase, believing I had lost my family over a canceled birthday. In reality, the cancellation exposed a structure that depended on my obedience. I hadn't lost them that night. I had stopped losing myself. The next morning, I framed Frank's final note and placed it inside the entrance hall where every new resident could see. Strength does not mean surrendering what is yours. Beneath it, I added one sentence of my own. And being family does not exempt anyone from the consequences of taking it. If you've ever been told you're too strong to need celebrating, remember this. Your joy doesn't require permission from those who profit from your silence. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you're rebuilding your own life after betrayal, drop a word in the comments. I'd love to know you're still standing.